to share my work and research with this group. I'm going to target for 45 minutes presentation, and so so that we have enough time after for questions, reactions, and conversation. So what I would like to say first, maybe as a way also to introduce this presentation, I divided it around three moments. The first moment will be more kind of a background, locating a bit the origin also of my work. Second moment about what I believe is at stake when we think about critical pedagogy, critical reflection, and time in education. And then a third moment that will open up more with this notion of rhythmic intelligence I've been working on, and see how that also open up maybe avenues for thinking and new research. So here we go. So I'm going to start by usually what we put at the end in academia, which is the reference list. So obviously, I'm not going to comment on this list. It's not to brag. It's just to show that what I'm going to discuss today, I've developed in different places. And so I really encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to look, and maybe I will share with you, Sean, also the PowerPoint in case people are interested to get the references. Just to say, there is a history there that's behind what I'm presenting today, a history of my reflection during the last 15 to 20 years, basically. And so most of what I'm going to discuss today pick from ideas that have been developed in different places. Now, more specifically, the two references I'm going to really refer to is the book I've wrote 10 years ago, Time and the Rhythms of Emancipatory Education, and a more recent article that I published a couple of years ago on rhythmic intelligence. And so maybe what I could say briefly is that this book was not my thesis. I mean, when I actually did my PhD, it was on another topic. And in a way, that book was like writing a second PhD, because basically I had to start from scratch. But when I wrote my PhD 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was interested in the concept of critique in education and how this concept has been developed mainly in French-speaking and English-speaking scientific literature. And it brought me to really try to enlarge the way this notion has been conceived, and also connect different traditions of research and practice in education. And toward the end of this research, I progressively came to realize that the question of time was absolutely central to think about the idea of critique in the contemporary context. If you look at the history of the idea of critique from antiquity until today, I mean, it's interesting to see how it evolved through different periods, where the preoccupation and also the understanding of what does it mean to be a critical thinker or to be a critical person, it evolves through different periods and different preoccupations. And I strongly believe that nowadays, one of the core issues that we have to consider if we want to seriously think about the work of being critical people and acting critically requires to think about the way we relate to time and have a complex understanding of what it means. And so that's a bit what I'm trying to develop, obviously in the context of education.
And Michel, sorry to disturb you. There's some comments in the chat about not being able to see this PowerPoint. Would you be able to share again?
Okay, yeah, that's so I'm stopping the presentation now. Going to exit. Okay, there's a time. Okay, so I'm going to try to share it again. I hope it goes through.
Thank you, and apologies for the interruption.
No, there's no problem. You know what? Let me try something else. Is it better like that?
We can see that. And then perhaps if you try moving to the next slide, just so we can see it's progressing.
Yeah, can you see this new slide?
No, it's still staying on the initial slide you
Oh,
showed us.
that's really weird. Okay, so I'm going to, oh, that's the first time. Sorry about that. So, okay, so what about that here? I'm going to be in a regular, not presentation mode, just a PowerPoint regular. Can you, if I move to the next one, does it change?
It does, yes. So in that mode, it does change. It's not in full slideshow, but we can see it and it's accessible.
So I'm going to zoom a bit.
Great, thank you.
Yep, I don't know why it sometimes, Okay, so
thank you, Michel.
Yeah, no worry. So okay, so that was the two references I was referring to. And if you scan the QR code, you'll go straight because the book is accessible in open access and the articles too. So what I did in this book was really I was trying to clarify questions that I had at that time, and I was trying to basically make three claims and answer three questions in a way. The first claim was that there is something very specific about the way we can think about time in educational sciences, because educational sciences is a fundamentally interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary field of study. Therefore, we can think about time borrowing resources from different disciplines, including social sciences, philosophy, psychology, and so on. And so I think, but there is something about articulating conception and theories coming from different disciplines. And therefore, I think there is something specific inherent in the study of time in educational sciences. So that's something I developed in the first part of the book. Then I was interested about the connection between time and the evolution of education praxis and educational theory throughout history. And so that's part of the second part of the book, that's basically building a kind of genealogy of the relation between time and education, and especially paying attention to the evolution of the different temporal constraints that have shaped the way education has evolved throughout time. And I will come back to some of that later. And then finally, what I was also trying to do in this reflection was to also claim another way, which I believe I think at that time was original, to conceive emancipatory education through the lens of time. And that's something I'm going to also try to develop this afternoon with you. So questioning basically what is the meaning of emancipatory education in a context where the experience of time is more and more often an experience of alienation and an experience of suffering. So I'm going to go very quick here, but just to say that when you look at critical pedagogies, and I take here the example of Paulo Freire or conception around emancipation in education through, for example, the work of Jacques Rancière, as it was also interpreted by Gerd Biesta, and also the example of Jack Medziro's contribution around transformative learning theory. In those three instances, what's interesting is that you have authors, among many others, obviously, authors who have reflected quite in depth about what does it mean to be a critical thinker and what does it mean to exercise some form of critical reflection with the aim of promoting emancipation. But you won't find in any of those writings consideration about time and the temporalities involved in the process of developing a critical capacity. And the assumptions about time are really, they are there somewhere. There is underlying assumptions, but they are not an explicit matter of reflection. Which doesn't mean that neither Freire, Rancière, or Medziro did not reflect on time, but definitely did not appear in their work, especially in their educational theories. And so there are different kind of underlying assumptions. So if you think about Paulo Freire's approach, I mean, if I take the example of the pedagogy of the oppressed, I mean, he's very explicit about the fact that the passage from a kind of naive position to a critical one occurs through some kind of disruption, and that can be facilitated, obviously, through an education process. But there's this kind of assumption about the discontinuity and the passage from a naive to critical position, where, for example, in Medziro's contribution, there is a more kind of developmental approach, where for him being critical and emancipatory learning has to do with the capacity to take distance with the assumptions you have, the way you interpret, you give meaning to your experience. And that occurs through a mix of disruption, what he called disorienting dilemma, that trigger the need to critically reflect on your experience, and then a succession of different stages that he kind of modeled through a kind of developmental approach that goes through different stages that have been actually quite criticized in the literature because they are kind of abstract and not necessarily, I mean, hard to find in the reality of people's experience. So, but there is this kind of incremental process where people are led to revisit and change the patterns that through which they give meanings to their experience. And in Rancière's conception, I mean, there is something about, and again, I borrow here Gerd Biesta's interpretation of Rancière's work around emancipation. But there's this idea that what he called the equality of intelligence, this idea that has to be checked in a way on a recurring base in a way. And so emancipation is not something that is taken for granted once for all. It's something that has to do with the capacity to repeat the action of checking that I'm considered as the equal of the other in different settings. And so there is therefore a more kind of everyday logic to it, everyday temporality, where emancipation is experienced on an everyday basis through the repetition of the possibility to assert and eventually check that we're considered as the equal of others. So the assumptions about time and the relation between time and critique are different in these three examples. But I think we need to go even beyond that. And I think we really need to think more systematically about the way we conceive the connection between time, critique, and emancipation. So what I would like to say here is, in the present context, I think that the experience of alienation appear or can be observed or experienced or lived through different form of situations that are often related to the way we experience, understand, and live the experience of time. So one aspect, for example, and that's something that has been pointed already decades ago by Richard Bagnall, the Australian philosopher of education, around the stress nowadays on presenteeism in education and the fact that it's more and more challenging to bring people to think in terms of either connecting with project in the future or being able to relate to the past and how that informed the present. So there is this kind of focus on present time and the hegemony in a way of present time, which can be experienced as alienating because it prevents sometimes people to connect the dots between different temporalities in their own life. There is also this feeling of time scarcity that is pretty prominent, and feeling of acceleration of life that has been already quite theorized by authors such as Hartmut Rosa and others. So alienation here comes with the fact that the natural rhythm that we would be kind of needing is conflicting with the acceleration of development and changes that occur from a technological perspective or from a social perspective. Another example has to do with what some colleagues in France call temporal exile, as an expression to describe the experience of people, for example, people who are unemployed and who therefore are not able to relate to the mainstream temporality associated with walking and the walking activities. And so the fact that that's something that has been observed by sociologists, the experience of being unemployed make you feel detached and in a way disconnected from the dominant temporalities that make people obviously participate to economical activities and so on. And so there is this feeling of being exiled because you are cut from that time. There is also another notion that I like to refer to. I borrow it from a French colleague, Gaston Pinault, who is also a thinker in the field of adult education. He coined it as schizochrony. Schizochrony from the Greek schizo, that is divided, chrony, chronos, time. And so this experience of being split between antagonistic temporalities. And the example that's often coming is the divide between working time and family time, for example. And the amount of suffering that comes from that split and that difficulty to connect and relate in a harmonious way, in a way different temporalities that compose our life. And finally, what I observe in the everyday in my practice in higher education, the challenge to find time also with learner to exercise critical reflection and to be able to provide learners and students with the time needed in order to develop one's thinking and go in more in-depth analysis. And at the same time, also the challenge to assert one's own rhythms, the temporalities that characterize who we are. And I will talk a bit about that later with the notion of idiorhythmy that I borrow from Roland Barthes, that somewhere assume that we all have our own rhythms, our own temporalities that shape who we are, and being able to assert the way we experience and privilege some form of temporalities in our life is crucial in order to feel in a way free and emancipated. So those refer to tension and challenges that we encounter, and it's in no way exhaustive as a list, obviously. So that for me also begs the question of how do we connect what we're trying to do when we think about critical pedagogy or transformative education, how do we connect that with such preoccupation? So long, I mean, at this point, there are many authors who have addressed some of those questions. And I group here 3 trends that I've seen emerging. And actually, since the book was published 10 years ago, I can see now that there's been actually even additional approaches that are emerging. So things have been evolving during the last 10 years. But when I was writing the book, there was really 3 stream, I would say, that were not really coherent, but that we could notice. One has to do with slow education. And slow education is a trend that emerged from, I would say, the 1980s, and that valorized the idea of slowness. You know, like there is the slow food movement in reaction to fast food. Well, slow education is really about this idea that we need to slow down in the classroom. We need to valorize slowness, which is great, which is critical to some extent, because for me, the limitation of that approach is that it kind of idealizes this idea of slowness, where attributing to slowness a value, a kind of absolute value, where in fact the idea of slowness as the idea of speed or acceleration versus deceleration are notions that are highly relative and depend on the context. So in some context, actually pretty good to be able to do things pretty fast. And in other contexts, it can be quite good to do them slower. So that's for me one of the limitations. But just to say that there is some literature there that constitute also some form of critical discourses around time. And then there's been also writings that criticize more specifically social acceleration. And you can observe this literature mainly in Germany, some extent in France, and it's emerging also in English, mainly inspired by the work of Hartmut Rosa and this idea that there is a critique to be formulated against acceleration. But again, for me, it goes back to this idea that somewhere acceleration is bad, deceleration is good, and therefore there's this kind of dichotomy and dualist way of thinking that I think tend to reduce the complexity of the way we experience time rather than complexifying it. And finally, the third trend that for me was very resourceful is what is identified in French as rythmoformation, mainly around the writing of authors such as Gaston Pinault or Pascal Galvani, so French authors who have tried to think about what does it mean nowadays to help adults, because it's in the field of adult education, to reappropriate for themselves the rhythms that compose their life and the different temporalities that organize the way we live in the everyday and through the life course. So someone like Gaston Pinault, for example, worked a lot in the field of life history and education. So for him, bringing adults to work on their own life history, writing their life narrative or sharing life narrative, was also a pedagogical strategy to bring them to reflect on the temporalities of their life and trying to compose also temporalities that may have been experienced as antagonistic, for example. And so the work of Gaston Pinault is really at the root also of what I've been doing through my books and other writings later. So now, from there, I think, and that's really the central point I would like to make today, I think it may be critical actually to envision an agenda of what does it mean to reflect on time in education and what is at stake. And I think there are really three paths that we need to explore more systematically. And I really think there could be a whole field of study obviously beyond those three axes, but that really go more in depth around the connection between educational processes, and the way we experience time and the temporalities that shape education. So those three axes that I'm going to briefly now describe or envision have to do first with studying the temporal constraints that shape educational situations and environment. What does it mean? That means that whether you think about formal education in school with kids or in adult education with adults, or informal educational context, learning processes, educational processes are always shaped by constraint, and those constraints can be conceived from a temporal perspective. And so I'm going to develop this idea. The second axis has to do with the fact that any learning, any transformational processes, any educational processes is fundamentally atemporal processes. It's inscribed in a duration. It's very rarely, if ever, something that would just emerge spontaneously. It can always be inscribed in a duration and in a process and in dynamics. And we need to also reflect on the way we understand how such dynamics develop through time and specifically the rhythms and the temporality that are constitutive of such processes. And finally, the third axis I will evoke has to do with the fact that the experience of time in itself can become a very powerful trigger to bring people to reflect critically on their experience. And that's something now that I've been doing in my own practice, because often, to give it as a kind of example, when all those reflections were triggered for me when I moved from Switzerland to the US. And I was asked to adjust and adapt a seminar that I was doing in Switzerland around using life history and asking students to share and write a life history to reflect on their educational processes. And I was asked to do that when I arrived at Teachers College, to really compress that process in just a matter of few weeks, because that's the way the program was organized. And I had to do that this way. And that really triggered a feeling of dissonance for me, because I really had the feeling that the learning process I was trying to convey could not be accelerated and compressed in such a short setting. And I got to the point where that dilemma, in a way, became something very explicit. So I was confronting students to the fact that I was under temporal pressure in order to do some process, some activities with them. And therefore, I also invited them to reflect on what does it mean and what does it translate in terms, and what can we learn about the institutions, about the different interests at stake and processes involved. And what could we learn about it from a critical perspective? So the experience of time, especially when it's made of tension, can be a trigger for critical inquiry and can be at the core of an educational strategy. So what I would like to do, I'm going to comment those three axes, but first I would like to just maybe say a few words about some key assumptions that also shape my work to make sure that, there is, to try to minimize the possibility of misunderstanding. So first, I would like to say that in my practice and in my research, I really tend to privilege the notion of temporality rather than the notion of time, because time is singular. And when we use time as a concept, we tend to reduce it to a very traditional conception of time that we inherited from classical physics, the Newtonian conception of time that is, abstract, reversible, quantifiable, and linear. Where in fact what we do in education is the opposite of that. It's not abstract, it's very concrete. It is not so much about quantity that it is about the quality of what we're doing and what people experience. It's not linear, it's non-linear, meaning that there are not every minute in the classroom has the same value. So just to say that I think it's important to diversify our conception and our understanding of time. The reason why I'm referring more to the notion of temporality. I would say briefly here, because it's important, I think that there are an infinity of temporality. And so what's the minimal definition without getting into a kind of more philosophical consideration about how we define it? I would say there are two criteria for me that are crucial. One is the presence of, or either through experience or observation of, changes that are more or less organized and that can be of very different natures, physical changes occurring in our environment, changes that happened in organism or in natural phenomena, changes that occur at the level of our thinking or feeling, or changes that occur at the level of our interaction and our life in society. So any kind of changes can be considered at the core of a specific temporality. Now, to recognize a temporality, those such changes need to be put in relation with a way to represent them. And time or temporality emerge from that relation that we establish between changes, either lived or observed, and a way to represent them. So it's always a relation. So for example, if I look at my watch, what I'm doing is actually I'm connecting numbers, for example, or the position of the handles on the dial with changes that occur in the universe that has to do with the position of the Earth around its own axis, or the position of the sun in the sky. And so those changes, physical, cosmological, are connected with symbols. And this connection establishes a form of temporality, that is a physical temporality in this case. Now, you can also connect the position of Earth around the sun with a calendar, and therefore you create another form of temporality that is also a physical temporality in this case, that has to do with the position throughout the year of this planet. Now, if I take my watch and instead of looking at the sky, I put my fingers on my wrist and I feel the pulse of my blood, I create another form of temporality that is a biological temporality, that refers to the biological rhythm of the activity of my heart. and the pulse of the blood in my vessels. So the same watch can provide me with another form of time. In this case, biological time. And so again, I connect two different kind of changes, the changes in my body, some changes in my body with the changes of my watch. And doing that, I envision another form of temporality. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily about number. It can be qualitative. It can be using word. When I ask students to write a narrative where they describe aspect of their life experience, what I'm asking them to do is envision on one side changes that occur in their life, in their relations, in the way they understand things happening to them, in the way the emotions have evolved maybe, and so on. So changes at different level of their experience with changes on the paper, on the screen represented by words. And therefore this connection between language on one side and the words on one side and the changes that occur on their life create a specific form of temporality that is a biographical temporality or a historical temporality if you want. And so qualitative in this case. So again, it has to do about connecting changes with way of representing them. And so the thing is that as soon as you start envisioning time as not being monolithic, abstract, and singular, but plural, therefore what we're doing is that we're swimming in an ocean of temporalities in a way. And so that means that, especially in education, we have to deal with temporalities from very different nature in a way. And I'm going to go back on that in a moment. So just to say also, because the title of my communication has to do with rhythmic intelligence, so I'm introducing here the notion of rhythm. Rhythm is a way, the reason I'm privileging that notion is because it's a very intuitive notion in a way. We all know what, by experience, in a way to recognize rhythms, although it's defining it is more tricky. But in a way, rhythms refer to a sense of time in a way. So because rhythms give us, rhythms in a way allow us to connect changes that occur either visually, if you think about the rhythms of a painting, or in experience, if you think about the succession of changes that can occur through a duration. And so rhythms kind of give an intuitive way to connect with the way we experience time. And so I also go back to that. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to those three axes that I've mentioned earlier and just say a few words about them as they open up, I think, way to think about the connection between time and education. So the first axis, if you remember, has to do with this importance of taking into consideration the temporal constraints that shape educational situation or environment. And so in the book, I define temporal constraint referring to the effects of heterogeneous temporalities that confine, bound, restrict, or put into tension the operations involved by educational phenomena, such as individual or collective learning, transformation, or development. So I was giving earlier the example of biological rhythm. Our body is a bundle of rhythms. And so there is the rhythm of sleep, there is the rhythm of attention, there is the rhythm of digestion, there is the rhythm of sexual function, and so on. And those biological rhythms are constraining. We all know what it looks like to teach right after lunchtime, because that's the time where the blood is in, the stomach and people have less capacity of attention. And therefore, biological rhythms are constraining the way our cognitive capacity can be exercised, for example. In the same way, social temporalities, such as those of institutions like school, work, and other form of social institution, also are also organized temporally in a way that is constraining. And so when I was giving the example of me moving to New York and teaching in an institution where the calendar was organized differently, it was representing a temporal constraint that was imposed on by the institution and the way it was organized. So I think there is really something critical there to think about the multiplicity of temporal constraint, or if you want, the multiplicity of constraint that impact the activity of learning and how they can be understood from a temporal perspective. So here I would briefly say that I tend to differentiate 4 families of temporal constraint: the biological one, the physical one first, the biological one, the psychological one, the social one. I mean, it's I like the metaphor of families rather than levels, because in a way those temporalities are actually often intertwined in a way that is not that easy to disconnect them and isolate them by levels. So obviously the alternance between night and day is a constraint that we have to consider. And actually, to refer to Gaston Pinault earlier, he developed a conception of learning where he distinguished between what he called nighttime and daytime learning, and not literally necessarily as being in the darkness as a way to inform specific way of learning, but more kind of anthropologically, because nighttime organizes social activities in a way that tend to privilege the time when we are on our own, where daytime tend to privilege social activities and interaction with others. Therefore, it shows how we can think about the way we learn informally throughout our life in different ways when we are on our own, what in French we call auto-formation versus hétéro-formation, the time where we learn with and through others. So the physical environment has also that impact on us. Biological rhythm, I mentioned it already. Psychological constraint, obviously attention, the evolution of mood, and different psychological state, and the fluctuation of those psychological state has an impact on the way we learn and develop ourselves, obviously. And social constraint, obviously, for example, through calendars of institution and so on. I also like to differentiate between symbolic and functional temporal constraints. There are the constraints that are functional, that have a direct impact on our activity. If you're in the obscurity, obviously there are things you cannot do. And so in the same way, if you are tired, there are some learning that may be more difficult to process. And there are also symbolic constraint, temporal constraint, that refer more to representation. So for example, if you are turning 65, you are retiring, there is somewhere a symbolic constraint that is attached to this age that say that once you are retired, you are not entitled to do exactly the same things, or that you are going to have to commit to different form of activities, or you have to withdraw. And therefore, there is symbolic constraint that are the product, obviously, of norms that have been defined socially. And so I think it's important in education to think about what are the symbolic and the functional temporal constraints that are exercised and that limits what we can do. Because in a way, when we say someone is 15 years old, what we are saying is basically this person has revolved 15 times around the sun. That's what we say. So in which way does that represent a legitimate constraint to allow or prevent this person to learn specific things? Now, obviously, that's not to say that there is not other constraints that are attached to that age that prevent eventually to develop specific activities. But we need to think about what does it mean to use age as a way to limit or encourage specific activities and learning activities. So temporal constraints are bivalent because at the same time they limit what we can do, and at the same time they can also be used as resources, and they can facilitate some processes. And so again, there is no absolute values behind a specific rhythm or temporalities. It's really more about the relation between different temporal constraints. And that's really one specificity of the work of education, is that we have to balance multiple temporalities when we are teaching or when we are facilitating learning, and being aware of those constraints may be critical. The second axis I want to briefly evoke here has to do with the fact that obviously learning as processes, development, transformational processes, they're all processes that are inscribed in time, that are demonstrating or expressing specific form of temporalities. And I think it's crucial also to question how we understand the specific temporalities of the learning processes that we are trying to favor or foster. And so we can think about, for example, the rhythm of discourses, the rhythm of embodied activity, or the rhythm of interactions as different entry points to access what constitute the temporalities of education. So when you think, if I take the example of discursive activity, I mean, when you read a text, or when you write a text, or when you tell yourself something in your own mind, so you use discourses to reflect on something, those processes takes time. And so there is something about also identifying the specific rhythms that are attached to specific learning. So obviously, if someone asks you to learn a new language, I mean, you have to learn Chinese or Italian, you won't be able to learn that over the weekend. That's something that's going to require a process that is inscribed in a duration and expressed by different rhythms, discursive, but also interactional, because it will depend on the way you interact with others and so on. And so I think it's about being realistic about what can be expected, but it's also about understanding exactly what is at stake from a temporal perspective. And so when people tell me, oh, it's great what you do when you work on life history, you know, we've been doing that over a few months. Is there a way for us to compress that over a weekend? Because if I want to do that in my institutions, I won't have more time. So again, what does it say about the way we understand the learning processes that are involved in a specific activities? And obviously not every learning can be compressed. And therefore there is something about understanding, but not every learning requires necessarily a long duration neither. Some things can occur pretty fast. So it's really also about questioning ourselves in the assumptions we have about the temporalities involved in specific educational processes. Okay, I'm going to skip a few slides because I see time is running. I want to make sure we have enough time. So what I would like to say at this point is that from a critical perspective, obviously emancipation is at the core when we think about critical pedagogy. And I think we need to revisit the way we think about emancipation from a temporal perspective. Emancipation is not a state that we could consider that we get once for all in our life. Emancipation is the product of a struggle, it's product of processes that unfold through time, that involve repetition, that involve situation that we live and we go through, and therefore it fluctuates through time. And I think there is something important in being able to envision how we conceive emancipation through time. And so the idea that I develop in the third part of the book is really this idea that we all have our own patterns in the way we emancipate ourselves throughout our life, and that emancipation unfolds through time in different ways, obviously for everyone. And it has its own rhythm in a way because it fluctuates between situation where we are more or less free and situation where we are more or less constrained. And those situations obviously alternate in different periods of our life. And so I think specifically as an education process, emancipation has to be conceived from a rhythmic perspective. And that means questioning three things. The patterns, that means the forms that constitute a movement of emancipation, the form of way of thinking, way of acting, way of interacting that may evolve throughout our life, and that evolves through repetition. And that's the second aspect of a rhythmic phenomena. It involves periodicity, so we can question the frequency or the periodicity of the situation that repeat themselves throughout our life. And the third aspect has to do with the variation. A rhythm is never only the repetition of the same pattern. It's also patterns that evolve, that vary through time, repetition that also a change of frequency and so on, and therefore there is variation. So those three aspects of rhythm, patterns, repetition, and variation, can be used to think about educational processes, and more specifically emancipation. I see that time is running, so I'm going to really maybe take 5 more minutes if it's okay for you to try to finalize. I won't say everything I was planning to say. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to say, the third axis, was really this idea that reflecting on time can become, and the way we experience time can be a trigger for critical reflection. And so that's the example I was giving earlier, this idea that when we are facing temporal constraint that can be debilitating or alienating in specific situation, reflecting on those can become a trigger for exercising critical reflection. So in the classroom, typically, I think that it can be very valuable to bring people to become more aware of the temporal constraints that are present and how they shape what is done or what is not done, why some rhythms are privileged and others are not, and matter of equality or inequalities. So I can only encourage also to develop praxis that involve the experience of time as a locus of reflection. And I would just say briefly, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm doing this research through the a British Academy program called the Times of a Just Transition, where we're reflecting with people who are involved in the socio-environmental transition through different activities. And the idea is to bring them to reflect on the temporalities involved in the changes that they are trying to either foster or implement, and therefore reflecting on the conflicting agendas or conflicting temporalities that they are facing when they are trying to implement changes. For me, is a way to exercise some form of critical pedagogy in a way. And so, but again, there is everything to invent in that context. I mean, there is no formalized pedagogy of time that has been really well developed. I mean, I have colleagues working on different form of temporal pedagogy, but really it's a whole field that would deserve to be developed. So to end this presentation, what I would say is that to be able to reflect on the way we experience different conflicting temporalities in our life and how the experience of time provide us with possibilities to reflect on conflict, on power dynamics, and conflict of interest, it also requires the development of a capacity to understand that temporalities are diverse, that they are conflicting, that they can be expressed to different ways. And that refers to this idea of rhythmic intelligence that I wanted to introduce. So for me, rhythmic intelligence refers to people's ability to individually and collectively regulate and critically reflect on the rhythms through which transformational processes shape and constrain their life. So the idea is that rhythmic intelligence is about the capacity to reflect on changes, on transformation, and the way they are inscribed in duration and the way they demonstrate or express specific rhythms. And there is a sense of rhythms that has to be developed for that. Said in another way, this idea of rhythmic intelligence came from me from research on rhythm analysis, and I refer here to the work mainly of Henri Lefebvre and Gaston Bachelard. And so this idea that analyzing the rhythms of the everyday life, as well as analyzing the rhythms that compose the life course, provide with an opportunity to think about the way we organize change in our life in a way, or cope and deal with changes in our life. And so rhythmic intelligence is not something, it's not a cognitive ability, it's not something that is just in the individual, it's also something that can be developed collectively. It has to do with the senses, and it's not just something rational. And it really refers about the way we can grasp the rhythmicity of the activities that we are involved in and learn to regulate the rhythm that compose the activities that we do and the activities that shape our life. So I'm going to stop here, and maybe I'll take advantage of some question maybe to go more in depth in some of those aspects. I'm sorry, I realized that I was not able to say everything I wanted to, so I hope it was coherent enough. But I'm going to stop here to make sure we have enough time for interaction.